It's recording. Welcome to today's workshop with Prof. Nilpias, who is a professor in the Rhodes Business School at Rhodes University, functioning as a research coordinator. He lectures in leadership, people management, strategy implementation, change management, and research design on the MBA and postgraduate diploma in enterprise management programs, as well as various executive short courses. His research interests currently lie mainly in the areas of leadership and its development, stakeholder theory, social entrepreneurship, and deductive approaches to qualitative research, which is part of the discussion that we'll be having with Prof today. He has authored and co-authored 25 journal articles, 7 books and chapters in books, and attended 44 conferences with conference papers that have been issued out of those 44. He has successfully supervised and graduated many doctoral candidates and Masters of Commerce candidates, as well as Masters in Pharmacy candidates. He has also been able to graduate 45 MBA candidates. So there's a lot that Prof has in terms of his background, but due to time, I think you will be able to go and check out Prof on the Rhodes University website. And I know some of the information might not even be updated in terms of some of the papers and some of the book chapters that Prof has. But without wasting any time, please keep your mics off and your videos off. I will now hand over to Prof to facilitate this lecture.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm going to go straight into my presentation and share that, and you should be seeing that in slideshow mode as well, if someone can just confirm it. You can see the slide?
Yes,
Prof.
we can.
Great, thank you. Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I've been invited to talk to this topic about deductive qualitative research. And the reason for that is it's something that we've been doing within the business school as a particular approach to doing both quantitative and qualitative research from a deductive perspective. And so as we've tried to do this, we look in the literature, there's not much there about how you go about deductive qualitative research procedures. There were a couple of guidelines here and there. And so I thought, well, maybe the way to actually teach this is to start to write about it as well. And so there's a couple of publications I started to generate. Those publications have then informed this particular seminar as well. And if you're interested in this approach, then you'd be welcome to approach me to get copies of those articles, but I've also included them in the presentation. So let me give you an outline of what I'm intending to cover today. There's first just the introduction to this workshop and the rationale. I'll talk to you in a bit more detail. I'll show you the different publications that have arisen from developing a method, I think, and a procedure for following this qualitative deductive approach. And then we get ready to the nuts and bolts of this particular approach, where I want to illustrate it by using 3 sets of questions, or 3 questions that we will be addressing this afternoon. And the first is to recognize this is a method that doesn't apply to all kinds of research. So when is it actually suitable to use deductive approaches to qualitative research? If you then choose to do it, how do you go about that? What are the steps involved? And then once you've conducted the research, how should the findings of the research be discussed in relation to the existing body of knowledge? So this is really about what is the kind of contribution you're making, what are the kind of answers that or problems that you're addressing, or research questions that you're addressing, and how do you start to relate that back to the existing body of knowledge related to that topic. So that gives us an outline for the sessions this afternoon. Just by way of the introduction then, firstly, as we go through this workshop, I mean, ideally it would be great if we could have done this face-to-face, but we are online. And so on the one hand, I am going to be illustrating the use of the technique or the approach, but I'm also very keen for us to have a conversation. And so at any point in the presentation, if you have a question, please either unmute and speak to me if I can't see your hand going up, or put your hand up, or if someone can just see if hands are going up and then just bring that to my attention. And so I'm very keen that we have a conversation or that we interact around this topic. So I did mention briefly why I've been developing this particular approach to doing the research. On the one hand, I've mentioned that as part of the MBA and the research we do within the MBA program, we took a decision some years ago to have both quantitative and qualitative research follow a deductive approach. In that way, we had more, let's call it uniformity in the approach taken, especially with the literature for whatever research students were doing within the MBA. And that just made it a lot easier to teach. It also then gave us more time to get into detail of steps and procedures and tools and techniques that we can introduce students to as part of the scaffolding around the method itself or the approach itself. But there's the other aspect to it as well, and that is my research most recently has largely been in the area of leadership and the development of leadership. And a lot of that research has been qualitative in nature. And if you critique what has happened to the body of knowledge on leadership, especially from a qualitative point of view, it's quite disparate. There's not this developing, emerging, distinctive body of research that you can say this is what qualitative leadership research is about. And I think that's true for many other topics or disciplines as well, that the qualitative research where it is done really doesn't always accumulate into a body of knowledge. There's often very different ideas, and maybe there's even this forgetting of what has been done, or not even really wanting to first acknowledge what has been done, but rather getting straight into the data collection in the field and making sense of that. And then afterwards, sometimes discovering actually you're coming across things that have been reported on and written up already. So if I'm arguing here, if qualitative research is to really start to make a meaningful contribution, then it needs to start to develop systematic ways for that contribution to be realized and to accumulate as a body of knowledge. And this is one of the reasons why this approach has been adopted then. So those are the two real reasons why we got to where we are now with this seminar of me then talking about this journey that I've been on with the MBA teaching in particular over the last 4 or 5 years. I mentioned there's a couple of publications that have come from that. There's a European Conference on Research Methods that I've attended a number of times, recently online. And in fact, I've got another attendance tomorrow online. And in some cases, I've then taken some of those publications, extended them, and developed them into journal articles. So these are the 4 or 5 publications that then are really articulating this particular method. And in addition to what is in those, there's also some of the work that I've done in supervising some of my MBA students that I'll be using today to illustrate the steps in particular that are followed in this method. Okay, so if we look at the conventional approaches to doing quantitative versus qualitative research, I'm sure many of you will recognize that qualitative researchers tend to be more interpretive, constructivist, phenomenological in their nature, in the approach, the paradigm that they adopt, whereas quantitative research is far more located within a positivist or post-positivist research paradigm. And the positivists are directed by this deductive approach. In other words, there's quite a systematic and thorough review of the literature, and using the literature as a launching point, certain deductions are made, often converted into hypotheses, and that informs the collection of data and you testing those hypotheses. Whereas with qualitative research, there's often an immersion into the field with quite a broad perspective of what you're looking for, a particular phenomenon you want to investigate. And more often the kind of data analysis is driven by the data itself. So it's data-driven coding rather than theory-driven coding, and sometimes moves towards a theory, but not always. Sometimes it's a descriptive account that is produced rather than developing or maturing it into a full theory. So that tends to be these two main approaches. And again, I'm just oversimplifying, I suppose, the main approaches to research to illustrate then what this particular approach is doing, which is saying, well, it's qualitative in nature, but it's adopting probably the paradigm of many behavioral type approaches that quantitative researchers adopt. So post-positivist in nature. And its point of departure is going to be the literature. And we're going to go into the field to collect data and see whether the data matches, if you like, the theory and the kind of propositions that are included in your review of the theory. So it's an unusual approach, and it's one then which, on the one hand, I've had to defend and argue, but then in addition to that, been trying to develop particular tools and techniques of how do we do this particular approach to, how do you carry out this particular approach to research. So before I move on to when it's suitable, I want to stop sharing for a moment and just hear if there's any questions or comments about what I've covered so far. I'm just going to keep an eye on the list of participants. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay, James, I see the thumbs up. I'm assuming all good. I can carry on. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions or hands up. So let me continue then with my presentation. So I'm going back to the slideshow. And so, as I mentioned after the introduction, I wanted to really structure this workshop to focus on three main questions. And the first then is, so when do we actually make use of this method? When is it suitable, when is it appropriate, if you like, to adopt this deductive approach to qualitative research? And I think there's four considerations here. The first is, what is the nature of this phenomenon that you are investigating? And one of the things I will develop further on is this idea that the phenomenon probably should be something that is observable. So the ontology is probably more a critical realist perspective, as opposed to something that is purely about people's opinions or experiences or perceptions. So this recognition that this method will work well if there's an assumption about a single reality that you are trying to investigate as the researcher. So that's the one key assumption. What is it that you're investigating? Does it lend itself to this particular method or not? The second is the level of maturity of the research concept that you're working with. So the body of knowledge, the theory, the concept that's then reflected in your particular research you're doing. And I remember years ago when I did my master's and PhD, I made use of grounded theory method. And for those of you that know grounded theory, it arose as a method in sociology where there was a critique of grand theory and saying, well, where do these ideas come from originally? Let's rather develop theories that are grounded in the data itself, hence the idea of grounded theory. And so that really starts to ask the question about where does theory, where does research begin, and how does it develop over time? And And what we'll look at is this idea that, well, theory often matures, and initially the research we do is probably going to be more exploratory, maybe more inductive, going into the field and seeing what is there. And then at a point, you want to flesh that out a bit, maybe in a more systematic manner. And it's at this point that the deductive thematic approach would start to be more relevant. I see there's a comment there from Monday. The deductive approach is very pertinent and relevant if you want to discover the real issues on the ground. You want to just talk a bit more to that point, Monday? You say it allows you to discover other ways of knowing, depending on what the theories are, but gives you room for new possible theories. And I think this is, you hit the nail on the head there, that on the one hand, you've got an idea of what you're looking for and wanting to test or check or look at the pattern of, but you want some flexibility. Monday, you want to add to that?
Absolutely, Prof. I think you've nailed it. Because I think, Prof, that's very important that, I think there's been, especially in the education theory, there's been this sense that there are other ways of knowing that we should acknowledge. In other words, due to sometimes different cultural practices and the fact that, somehow the Western way of knowing has been so universal or assumed to be so universal, at the expense of other ways of knowing. So it is very important to acknowledge that there are other ways of knowing that actually could add value, not discounting. That's very important. Not discounting the other ways of knowing, for instance, from the West. So it is very important that we should always have that space. And I think what you were talking about, deductive, it allows that, for us to explore that. I think you have hit it on the head, the nail on the head.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, so it gives you that space to say, on the one hand, I'm acknowledging what is there, but I also can look for other ways of knowing, other content, other knowledge, other areas that would expand or maybe shift what we know about this in this particular setting as well. What kind of data is available and what kind of process you're going to be following in investigating or in conducting your research. So just to pick up on each of these in a bit more detail, the nature of the phenomenon being investigated is, and I've suggested it already in terms of the post-positivist type approach, it is more observable or observed data. So it's taking a more objective position. And I often explain this by talking about a court. When you go to court, you have witnesses, and the witnesses are there to give an account of what they've observed. And based on what they observed, you then construct this single reality. It's a stable reality. This is what actually did happen, is what you're trying to determine in that court. But you are constructing that picture of that stable single reality that occurred from the various testimonies, or largely, if you like, from qualitative data. So this is a kind of phenomenon that would be suitable for investigation using this method, where you're focusing on observable behavior. So from a leadership point of view, it's about leadership behavior that's being observed, and how leaders behave in particular, for you to be able to make those observations and observe the patterns of leadership behavior, for example. The idea of the maturation of the research concept, there's, I can't remember offhand whose work it was now, but they spoke about how a particular concept matures over time, and there's these three phases that they identify. Firstly, the concept and its introduction, and then you start to elaborate on it. And then later it becomes more evaluating the appropriateness and suitability of that, and where is it appropriate, where is it not appropriate, and augmenting or adding to that concept. And eventually there's consolidation and accommodation of the concept, as they refer to it. And as we move towards the right, you tend to find more mature concepts tend to be examined far more from a quantitative point of view. This is where we're concerned about maybe the generalizability of certain ideas, where on the left-hand side, it's about exploration. And so maybe the qualitative approaches are more appropriate there. And so it's, as we start to expand on augment and elaboration and augmentation is where this deductive approach, on the one hand, starts to help with this development of a trajectory, but allows room for adding to it, as Mondi and I had that discussion. It's that kind of process that's taking place. What type of data do you have available to you to collect? And if we think about this in quantitative terms, we'd often talk about, well, how many variables or how many items, if it's a questionnaire, are there, how many items in that questionnaire versus what's the size of your sample. And what we find often in qualitative studies, there are multiple data points, but there's a small sample. So in fact, you wouldn't be able to reasonably or feasibly do any kind of quantitative research here anyway, because there's just too many points of observation or too many points of data collection that you have, or if I use quantitative terms, too many variables you want to examine simultaneously in your study, or far more than the sample allows. So this is very typical of case study research, for example, that you are observing a phenomenon, an event, an unfolding of a particular series of events, and you're trying to explain how and why it unfolded in a particular way. So you're looking at a whole lot of things happening, but with a very small or limited number of cases or small sample size. So a case study type research would certainly be able to use this kind of approach to doing the data collection and analysis as well. The third reason for following this approach would be to investigate process, and I've italicized that idea of process, and I want to talk a bit about that. Again, I'm just seeing there's a comment in the chat there. Okay, I think that's on another point, so I'm not going to go to that now. So in terms of investigating the idea of process, what I think is quite unique about certain types of qualitative studies is that they are looking at process, meaning there's an unfolding of events, which actually means the key phenomenon or concept that you want to study is changing over time. And so because it's changing over time, because it's a series of actions or operations, and there's this time dimension to them, their actual nature is changing. So in fact, you would not be able to measure them in a quantitative way, because what you measure today would be different to what you're looking at tomorrow. It's not the same thing, and therefore cannot be measured in the same way. So you are trying to investigate and explain and analyze this process that's unfolding. And so the only way you can do that is to look at it from a qualitative point of view. Moving on to my next slide then. I want to then move on to talk about what are the steps involved in carrying out this deductive approach. There's a 7-step process that I've outlined. But again, just before we go on to that, I just want to pause again and just hear if there's any further comments or questions about when do we use this approach? When is it appropriate? When is it not? Is there anyone that maybe has a question in relation or comment in relation to that? Okay, I don't see any hands. So back to the presentation. Okay, so then the question is, if I'm going to follow this qualitative deductive approach, how do I do it? What are the steps, or what's the process or procedure that I can follow? And at a high level, we're recognizing we're beginning with the concepts, And we're beginning with the literature. That's our point of departure. It's a deductive approach. And what I'll be expanding on is this idea of, from the literature, you're developing a conceptual framework. Within that framework, there are certain research propositions that you want to examine. So in a case study context, we're talking about explanatory case studies as opposed to exploratory case studies. Given the particular concepts and the research propositions I have in mind, I can then develop a coding frame and a memo from that conceptual framework, and that guides me in both the collection and the analysis of the data. So this is the approach I'm taking when I'm doing deductive qualitative research. The literature is the point of departure. I review that, I create this framework, and that guides how I'm going to collect the data, and I can determine that coding framework ahead of the field work. This is a critical point about the deductive qualitative approach. And then as I collect and analyze that data, I'm really comparing it to the pre-existing coding framework that I've put together. A memo, Kate, I'm talking about a memorandum, and I'll show you an example of what that coding memorandum looks like just now. But it's starting to define what each of my codes or labels are, how I'll observe them, and what would qualify a particular piece of data to be included or not. This is what I mean by the coding memo. Okay, so when I get to that in more detail, if you've got a follow-up question on that, Kate, feel free to ask that. Okay, I'm going to be using examples shortly. Let's get into some of those. And I think as I get into that example, then I address Sheila's concerns there, or question there. Okay, so here's a 7-step process, and this is set out in some of the articles as well, where I explain each of the steps and I illustrate them as well from various examples. So the point of departure, as I've mentioned, is the development of the conceptual framework. And then as you have that framework, you would then see there are certain research propositions that are embedded in that framework. You need to make those explicit. Once we have that, then it's the code book and the coding memo. I'll give you some examples of those. Once we know what kind of codes we're looking for to go into the data, to go into the field to collect that data, we need to then frame in this case, it's an example of doing interviews. I need to then frame the questions I ask in the interview to make sure I get data related to that coding memo. So I'll explain the question matrix to you. Of course, once you've done step 1 to 4, you then should be in a position where you can go into the field and collect your data. You then come out and analyze that data, applying really the coding memo and writing it up as themes. And that's what the reporting would look like. So today I'm going to spend a bit of time then illustrating those first 4 steps in particular. And here's an example that I use in my MBA class as well, just to illustrate this idea of a deductive approach to doing qualitative research. And so I give them an exercise in relation to New Year resolutions that people make and the personal changes that they have maybe decided as a resolution. And then they interview each other about how that's gone and what are the challenges and what worked and what didn't work. And that's really then following quite an open-ended and inductive approach to that interview that they then analyze. And then after that, I show them this model and I said, so what if this had been our point of departure? And this is a model from someone called Fogg, who writes about personal change. We apply it then to the example of a healthy lifestyle, for example. And Fogg says there are certain triggers, there are certain motivators, and there's what he calls ability, but actually it's about simplicity. The easier it is for me, the more likely I am to make a personal change. If I'm motivated to make the personal change, then I'll make that change. And there's certain kinds of things that will motivate me. And there are certain triggers that will spark me to make this change. So this is his theory. And so in the light of that theory, we can then start to develop certain research propositions. And every framework, if we go back to that previous step, has certain nodes and certain connectors. So the nodes are the concepts themselves, so such as triggers, motivators, simplicity, and then we have the three arrows as the connectors. And so wherever there's an arrow, we can then start to formulate a research proposition. So you can see there's a proposition for the triggers, there's one for the motivation, and there's one for ability or simplicity. And so an individual is more likely to adopt a healthier lifestyle when there are triggers. And in Fogg's article, he talks about three types: sparks, facilitators, or signals for the behavior change. Similarly, with motivation, people are motivated, he argues, by pleasure, hope, or acceptance, or the avoidance of pain, fear, and rejection. So we're looking for particular ideas in relation to what triggers are, what motivation is about, what ability or simplicity is about. And this is then specified in these three high-level propositions. I could, of course, break triggers down into three sub-propositions, one about spark, one about facilitator, one about signal. Motivation could have 6 sub-propositions, one for each type of motivation there, or avoidance of. And then similarly, ability, simplicity, there's a number of different areas there that would be sub-propositions. In the light of those propositions and the sub-propositions that are illustrated there, I can then develop a whole lot of codes right up front before we've even gone into the field to say, this is how I'm going to code my data. And I've used maybe codes that are a bit lengthy in their abbreviations, simply to try and capture the differences between the triggers, the motivators, simplicity, and then the healthy lifestyle codes. So all of this can be constructed up front. Before you're going into the field, you are then creating your code book. And so those of you that are going to use NVivo, for example, you could set up the codes in NVivo using this kind of methodology. This is your code book according to those 4 main areas that you're looking at: triggers, motivation, simplicity, and healthy lifestyle, for example. And step 4, let me just jump back to so we've spoken about the conceptual framework and the propositions. I'm talking about the code book and the question matrix. I'll come back to the coding memo just now, but you can see in these slides how on the first column, there's a listing of the different questions that I want to ask as part of my interview schedule. And what this matrix allows you to do is to check against each of your propositions, whether that question is relevant to the proposition or not. So in other words, we are trying to avoid the situation where you leave the data field, you finish your data collection, and as you're busy with analysis, you realize, oh, I haven't got any data pertaining to this particular topic. And yet you should have, because, well, you should have known what kind of questions to ask to cover that. You can't come out and say, I don't know. You should have let's say in simple terms, a yes or no response. So in an interview, there's often more general questions up front. And then what's illustrated on the next slide is some more specific questions related to particular, for example, abilities, and probing those as sub-questions that might be relevant there. So what has made it easy for you to change your behavior? That's this idea of ability or simplicity. So what has made it easier? And now there's a whole lot of follow-up prompting questions. How much time does it require? How much money does it require? Did it cost you very little and therefore it's easy to make? Or was it very expensive and that makes it hard? How much physical or mental effort was required? These are all the ideas that I can then extract from Fogg's article to be able to help me formulating my questions for the interview. And as I said, this is just a simple illustration from one article, obviously in many of your studies, you would do a more extensive reviewing of the literature, and that synthesis of the literature would help to identify the kind of questions that you'd be asking. But that's an illustration then of how you're developing this question matrix that really ensures when you exit the field, you've asked the right kind of questions. And so what it also means is your interviews is still semi-structured, but maybe leans more towards being structured dialogue as opposed to inductive approaches, which are maybe more or less structured, but still semi-structured in the approach. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment there. I know there was a comment in the chat, Mondi, and I think Sheila as well had comments. Just wanted to see what they were about and invite people if they want to make a comment about what we've been talking about. Yeah, so Mondi, your point about doing things, right? At a master's level, you want to demonstrate that you've mastered the research process. And at the doctorate level, then you've got to do more than that. You've got to be able to demonstrate that you've made some sort of contribution to knowledge as well. Okay, I'm not seeing all of the chat comments, but just want to check. Anyone want to say anything at this point? Okay, going back to my screen, sharing the screen. Okay, so I was illustrating the question matrix, and I want to go back to this idea of a conceptual framework and how we are going to, let me go back to my steps. We're going to be doing data analysis in step 6, which is about what I like to call pattern matching, and that's also the name of a particular approach to qualitative analysis. So here's an example of that, where from the literature, this person, and this is one of my MBA students, was looking at 2 particular leadership approaches, namely relational leadership and strategic leadership. And each of those have a number of subdimensions. So you can see relational leadership is about having informal dialogues. The informal chats the leader has builds relationship. Making formal speeches or having formal dialogues and engaging in activities that build trust and confidence in the leader. These are certain aspects of relational leadership. At the bottom, it's about the strategic leader setting a vision, building core competencies, developing human capital. And what we did was we looked at work by Edgar Schein on cultural mechanisms. There's about 14 different mechanisms he's identified. And so the study is trying to look at how leadership cultivates a particular culture, in this case, a culture of accountability. And so we looked at mechanisms related to what do leaders pay attention to, what do they measure, what do they control, what are the kind of systems and procedures they use, what are the stories they tell, what are the formal statements they make. And these are the mechanisms that start to shape or potentially shape the culture of the organization. And in particular, we were looking at how that shapes accountability. So this picture here then represents a simplified picture of the conceptual framework, identifying the main concepts and how they're related in this process whereby leaders cultivate the culture of accountability through exercising certain styles or approaches to leadership and through certain cultural mechanisms that help to shape the culture. And with that kind of framing in mind, essentially, sorry, I seem to be missing a slide somewhere. Essentially, what the candidate was trying to do then is to match what kind of data was collected with each of those, in this case, cells in the table. So as they conducted informal dialogues, was there particular evidence that these dialogues were around particular themes, were indicating what leaders paid attention to? Were they about measurement and control aspects. Informal dialogues are less likely to be about systems and procedures, but certainly if we look at human capital, developing the human capital of organizations, we can put systems and procedures in place to do that. And so all the yellow blocks here indicate the areas where she was hoping then to gather data to say, this in yellow is the pattern that I'm hoping to see as I speak to people about this culture of accountability, and I talk to them about what leaders have done, and I analyze that from the perspective of particular leadership approaches and the cultural mechanisms. How does this culture get shaped? And we're looking for, as I said, evidence of informal dialogues. There are statements that are made, and that has a contribution to shaping the culture. In trust building happens through what leaders pay attention to and what they don't just ignore, for example. It also happens through the stories that they tell. Leaders who set out a vision clearly show what that particular focus is, or what their focus is going forward, what they're going to pay attention to. The vision is often communicated to people through stories, but there are often also formal statements that go with that. So there has to be this careful mapping of the literature to determine the theoretical pattern that is represented in the conceptual framework. And this is what you're going to be then looking at the data, or looking at the data to see whether it matches these patterns. I want to just go back to this example. So you can see how we've taken these different elements, created that matrix or that table, and tried to identify the areas where we want to collect data, the yellow cells that I showed you in the table earlier on. So this is about cultivating leadership culture. That's one particular example of one of my MBA students' work. I want to turn to another student's work that looked at change in organizations and the employment of what are called change champions. Maybe employment's the wrong word, rather people who already are employed are asked to volunteer to be champions of the change. So it's not as if their formal role is to be the change agent or to implement the change, but rather in addition to their normal role, they champion and support the implementation of this initiative. And so this candidate, she looked at the idea of this kind of change championing role being a source of role conflict. So her literature review was about change and change champions. There's actually very little about change champions, but the literature on role conflict is quite mature and identifies a number of different types of role conflict. You can see those 5 on the tables that she investigated. And so she was really wanting to see, can this idea of role conflict help to explain the kind of conflicts that change champions encountered? So with that theory in mind, she then had to develop a coding memo or coding manual. So the memo would just simply be the listing of the codes themselves, but this is then the coding manual that I was referring to earlier on. And so she's going to, in her coding manual, which she constructs, by the way, prior to going into the field, she will have a label. So it will be personal role conflict, and whether she uses an abbreviation of, let's say, PRC for personal role conflict, she can have her abbreviations or her way of labeling the actual data. But what's important here is that she then has a formal definition which would have come from her literature review to say, by personal role conflict, we mean there are differing values, preferences, and or lack of skills that inhibit meeting a role's requirements. And so for each one, she'd have a formal definition. But one of the things with doing research is that we can distinguish between a formal or formalization of the definition and an operationalizing of the definition, or if I go into the field, what am I expecting to see? What will this concept that I've defined actually look like in the field? And this is where she then gives a description of occurrence. And so we're saying things like, well, person-role conflict is about the change champion's own role expectations, their values, their preferences, and that those are in disagreement with those of one or more role senders. So what the person values, what they're expecting, what they'd rather do or not do, clashes with what others are telling them to do. And so for each one, we've then identified or given a description of occurrence. What are we looking for? We're looking for stories that tell about this disagreement between what's important to the individual and what others are expecting of them, these others being then the role senders, whether that be other employees, fellow employees that at the same level, or maybe that report to them, or even their own manager, or the change agent, or the HR person who's responsible for this initiative overall, or the CEO. What are they saying this change champion should do? And does that create some sort of disagreement or conflict for what is important to them as an individual? So we go from a conceptualization of the label to operationalizing of it by describing its occurrence. And then the last column develops, well, we can start to formulate that up front, but it also develops as you get data, where when you want to label a particular data, you might find, well, I'm not quite sure where to put this. It might seem to belong in more than one category. So what we start to do is we evolve these qualifications and exclusions criteria. So to qualify for person-role conflict, what we're saying is this must be related to a single role only. Whereas in other cases, like role incompatibility, the bottom line there, that's about two roles. So to qualify as role incompatibility, it needs to have two roles that are clashing or incompatible with one another. So these kind of qualifications criteria you can set up front based on your definitions and descriptions of occurrence, but they get refined as you collect more data and as you try to figure out how to code it or how to differentiate one label from another as you apply it to particular pieces of data. And so I've just tried to illustrate that in this table. This is what the coding manual involves. And you might have another column that just gives an example to illustrate verbatim a quote, or to have a summary of a description of the incident that represents that particular kind of conflict. Again, I just want to pause and check I haven't lost you, and to check if there's any questions about that coding memo. There were some questions earlier on, or people asking about the coding memo earlier on. Let me just remember who that was. Trying to go back, Kate. I think it was yourself. Okay, thumbs up. Thanks, Kate. I see that. All right, so I'll go back to my example. And just to remind you, what I've tried to do is set out these 7 stages or steps. From the literature, we have a conceptual framework. We develop research propositions. We can then, based on that, formulate a code book. We can then set up a coding memo I've just illustrated. Based on the code book and the memo, we can then formulate our interview questions, for example. And then, of course, there'd be the data collection, analysis, and reporting. And so that takes me to data collection, where essentially we're going in, we're conducting the interviews, for example, or in some cases, qualitative research may make observations, but normally if they're qualitative observations, there'll be some sort of noting of that. Or alternatively, you might be looking at documents and you you're analyzing those documents, but the data itself is qualitative in some form or other, as opposed to quantifying that data or being in a number format. And so when you come back to analyze the data then, it's really about applying the code and the memo to label the data. And I've tried to give an illustration of that from the coding memo. As I pick up a piece of data, what label do I give that? So going back to this example, is this thing that I'm observing, this occurrence, this behavior, this event or incident the person's describing to me, is this an instance of role strain? Or do I label it role incompatibility, for example? And I use my coding manual to then figure out what is the right code to apply to that piece of data, that incident, that event that's been described to me. So I apply the code to label the data. Once I've got my data labeled, I would then want to sort it and group it according to the coded data. So again, going back to this example, I would want to group all the instances of role ambiguity together to be able to write about role ambiguity or to write about this topic or theme of role ambiguity. So I've got to sort my data in some way. And again, programs like NVivo can do that. There's also, I've got an article that I came across by someone called OSE, it's OSE, and she describes how you can use Excel to do this sorting or grouping process. Once I've grouped the data, I've got all the data related to that same label together. I can now start to see the patterns or the themes in that data, and I can start to write it up as a theme. And I can then start to record what we call the hits and misses, which is where we're starting to apply pattern matching. And I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. So in the reporting, often in qualitative research, there's a background that I need to create. It's more descriptive. It's describing the context often of the case or the events or the setting. And then there's the more analytical component, which is the deductive research. And I can write that up according to those different propositions for that matter. So that gives me the structure for my findings chapter. And then as I'm writing up those different themes by proposition, research proposition, I can then start to use this pattern matching technique to see whether or not the patterns that the theory spoke of are found in the data that I've collected and analyzed thematically. So it's as if I'm applying this pattern or template from the theory to my data to see whether the data conforms to it or not. And this is the idea of pattern matching, and where if we then go back to this table, we would want to indicate what we are the hits and misses. So in my example of, or in my particular data collection that I do, did I find any examples or any incidents where there were informal dialogues that illustrated how leaders pay attention to particular things, how they measure and control certain things that are creating this culture of accountability? If they are, then I'd have a tick in that box. If I'm finding they're actually paying attention to other things that are actually maybe not related to accountability or even undermining accountability through their informal dialogues that they have, then I might put a cross there instead. And so I start to see the overall pattern of what is in my data according to the key elements of my conceptual framework. And this would then be a pattern of hits and misses, where I could even maybe quantify, if I wanted to, how many incidents, how prevalent were particular themes. If you do want to do that, you could do so, but that probably takes it more into a different type of analysis as opposed to just thematic analysis, where you appreciate and value even single cases that might have arisen. And we're just acknowledging that we didn't have a large sample, and it was what we had investigated with the participants in this study. This is the pattern that emerged, and we're not trying to draw general statements on that. I mentioned writing up the background to the case, applying the deductive research, doing the pattern matching. So there are descriptive elements about the case. There's a description about the leader and what they've done to implement this particular culture of accountability. So there's something of the actions of the leader. There's a description of the culture and what does a culture of accountability look like. And then we can then start to look at the behavior. What is their focus? And we can then start to structure the presentation according to those thematic findings in relation to relational leadership and strategic leadership, and the three elements that were in each. So just to explain that briefly again, from our literature, we had this kind of theoretical framework in mind, or conceptual framework in mind, that we wanted to use to gather data and to analyze that data. Once I've collected that data, I've analyzed it, I'm going to write it up, and that becomes the kind of structure that I apply. There's descriptive elements, and then there's the deductive thematic elements, where I start to do more of the analysis component of the leader's behavior and structure it according to those two main dimensions of leadership. And then I spoke briefly about the pattern matching already, that this often is quite a useful table to include in your findings, especially towards the end, where you are trying to consolidate the overall pattern of findings. And what is more, you will recall, let me again just take you to that we were juxtaposing two different explanations or two different theories here of relational leadership and strategic leadership, and how those approaches to leadership create this culture of accountability. From our pattern of hits and misses, we get a sense of the kind of contribution each one makes, and certainly recognize, even in the theoretical formulation of the conceptual framework, that these are complementary styles or approaches to leadership. But what we'll be able to see from the hits and misses is which one was more prominent in the data that I collected, and how do they start to complement one another. So all six of them could potentially contribute to this cultural mechanism of what leaders pay attention to, what they measure and control. But in this particular case, what was most prominent? Was it really that strategic leadership got a lot more emphasis in terms of this cultural mechanism? In other words, it was about the vision, it was about the competencies that are developed and how they were developed. It's about the human capital and how people were developed in the organization. Or was it about the speeches that were given, the formal dialogues? And you can see how formal dialogues and vision would complement one another or overlap with each other in terms of those two theories. So the pattern matching table of hits and misses can help just to give an overall picture of what these two sets of theories had produced as I applied them as templates to analyze my data. So now I've done the findings. What does this mean then for how I go about discussing this set of findings? And if we look at the idea of testing research propositions, we really, from our data, we're looking for something that matches a particular theory. So from a deductive point of view, that's what our starting point has been. We've got a pattern from the theory. We're wanting to see whether or not the data matches that. And this is what our propositions were basically proposing. And so in our discussion, we would want to answer, how did what did the results show? Were we able to confirm or not confirm? Were we able to, or if I use quantitative terminology here, accept or not, or reject the propositions that we stated? This is what we'd be wanting to talk about in our discussion. But over and above that, we would want to be showing how our own research has contributed to theory building. So there'd be the citing of the literature reviewed earlier, and trying to get a sense of how that theory has developed over time, and where I'm contributing to that, or potentially contributing to that, or how I've either elaborated or augmented the existing literature. And it's this idea of this augmenting, the expanding, the fleshing out of aspects that maybe haven't been considered or are not represented in the current theory, that are really probably trying to make the most contribution by adopting this particular method. And then one of the challenges that you face as a qualitative researcher is, where do you locate yourself on this continuum of, in simple terms, is there something unique, a unique case that I'm really looking at, through to, on the other extreme, I'm trying to generalize to well, all pigeons in my metaphor, right? So is it about this one idiosyncratic, unique pigeon, and this is what this particular case is about? Or on the other hand, is about all pigeons everywhere and how they behave? And the deductive thematic approach is located somewhere in the middle of that I'm wanting not to generalize to the point I strip out all kind of contextual information, but rather I'm presenting a more general case in a particular context, if I can explain it in those terms. So I need to be quite deliberate in how I discuss what I've done in relation to the existing literature, to, on the one hand, show the contextualization, but also to identify those elements that others can read about and transfer to new situations. So in qualitative research, we don't talk about generalizability, but rather transferability. And so this is why I say we're somewhere between those two. I see there's a comment in the chat. Okay, so it's more a comment. Someone has to leave. Okay, and I think that then takes me to the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I'm hoping we can have some interaction. Quasi or fuzzy generalizability. Yes, it is kind of quasi and fuzzy, James, I agree. Any further comments from anyone about this method? Any questions you got about its application to your own research? Sheila, please go ahead, unmute and carry on.
Thank you. So, Prof, the one thing that always worries me about quantitative research as compared to qualitative research is that qualitative research, it's easier, isn't it? You can put it into a system, it's numbers, it gives some comfort. It's like a crutch, right? So
it's mechanistic. There's a set process, yes. Correct, yeah.
Yes. So what I'm saying is the competence of the researcher here in this instance is an important factor. What is your advice? How do you, what do you propose if we would like to adopt this? How do we make sure that we are at the requisite level of competence to be able to execute on it properly? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. So I think one of the reasons for following this deductive approach as opposed to an inductive approach is that as a researcher, you, in following qualitative inductive approaches, are far more the research instrument. I remember there's a book, I think it's in the education library by Renata Tesh, and she lays out on a continuum different approaches to qualitative research. And on one extreme was very unstructured approaches that she called educational connoisseurship. And then on the other, the far more structured narrative analysis and the like. And if I think of the education connoisseur, you might think of a wine connoisseur, an art connoisseur. There's something about their own knowledge and expertise that makes them the expert to be able to make that judgment. And so being, I suppose, integrated, invested in part of that community, you then, I suppose, more as an art as opposed to as a science, you're able to make the judgment. And that's quite difficult from a research point of view if you're on that very ill-structured side. If you are new to a particular field, or a novice researcher, or trying a different kind of approach to doing research. And this is why we actually need more scaffolding, more tools and techniques, more of a process to assist us to, not quite as mechanistically as the quantitative researchers, but in similar fashion, to give a step-by-step process to follow. And this is, Sheila, one of the reasons why I've developed this kind of framework and the set of steps for students and tools and resources that they can draw on to actually follow those steps. So that for me is the one thing, that you need to do your own assessment of what is your skill as a researcher, as well as what is your preference. But given your skill set, what then do you need to augment that? What kind of resources, what kind of tools are at your disposal? Or are you confident and comfortable being the research instrument and maybe operating in a far more intersubjective way than trying to lean more towards an objective, structured approach to analyzing your data that uses certain tools and techniques? If I can maybe just add one more point to this, I saw the same thing within grounded theory studies, where those that know about grounded theory know that Glaser and Strauss, who came up with the idea originally, had a major fallout because they were interpreting the technique differently to one another. And Strauss was the one who really brought in many tools and techniques that helped the researcher to really interrogate and almost structure the data in particular ways, and very active as a researcher, you're the research instrument. Whereas Glaser was very critical of that, saying, let it emerge, let the pattern in the data emerge rather than imposing certain structures on it. But I think that kind of scaffolding, that kind of structure, again, is helpful to the researcher. And so this is where then, if you have this kind of scaffolding, if you have the structure, if you're familiar with the tools and techniques, it's then about applying them, much like in other cases where the statistician has certain tools and techniques and they follow the steps to apply their trade. It's not as detailed as that, but it's leaning towards that, a more structured approach, Sheila. Thanks for that question. All right, are there any further questions, comments from anyone? I'm just checking through the list. There's no hands up I can see. Monday, your hands up. Thanks for the applause, James. Monday, go ahead.
Thanks, Prof. And for me, Prof, the way I see qualitative and quantitative is that always those methodologies always fit into each other, depending on what is it, what is it that you want to understand at a specific moment. For instance, you might as well start where you've got kind of unclear concepts and you still want to explore things. You can always start with qualitative research, because then it will give you a firm hand on what is at play, And then if you then want to quantify and understand the lay of the land, then you can then go on, having done qualitative research, and go on and do quantitative research after you have found out what is there in the field. So I always see them as kind of complementary. Of course, not always all the time, but I see them that way, depending what is it that you really want to look into.
Yes. And Mandy, if I can just develop what you're saying as well. So what you're really starting to touch on is the idea of mixed methods, and in
Absolutely.
particular, sequential mixed methods where you've got, let's say, your example, qualitative followed by maybe a quantitative study. And I imagine in that case, as you said, you're not quite sure what you're looking for. You want to go into the field in a more exploratory way. Probably inductive qualitative approaches work well there. And then based on what you find, you can then do your quantitative part or leg of that particular study. Whereas I think if you go the other way, if you've got a quantitative first followed by qualitative, then maybe the qualitative is more deductive in its approach, because there's particular things that you want to probe in more depth, maybe that have come out of your quantitative phase of your research. So that's, again, maybe quite a broad generalization, but it's just a thought that came to mind as you spoke about the mixed method and quant versus qual. Thanks for that, Mandy.
Absolutely. Thanks, Prof.
Right, I'm looking for other comments, other questions. Not seeing any. Does that mean we've come to the end of our session? Do we have any further? Doesn't look like it, eh?
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prof. And also thank you so much to everyone that's here. You know, I've been listening to the session and understanding how important the deductive approach is, especially when it comes to qualitative research. So thank you so much for the presentation. And just to respond to the question regarding the recording will be made available by tomorrow to everyone that is registered to join the session. Also, we would like to ask Prof to send us the slides so that you can include them in the recording, because usually students would want to ask for the slides as well. So thank you so much to everyone that has joined in. We will see you next week, and the link for next week's workshop will be advertised on Monday as usual. Have a good Wednesday further, and thank you again, Prof.
Thank you very much, Asipe. Thanks everyone for your attendance, and all the best with your own research. Thank you.